Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. Quick introduction here to Mr. Ken Fucik and why we are gathered here today. This virtual program series, our Communiversity series, is an offering that we started last year, sort of in the response to COVID shutting down the majority of our on-site operations for the season. We wanted to find a way to still connect with our audience, and we just have such a wonderful network of people with expertise in different areas or experiences in different areas to share. And so this is a free program series that we offer with the help of many people in our network. So thank you for joining us. Ken is a Grand Lake community member. I first met Ken, well, I guess probably it was 2016. Yeah, I think that's right. We worked on a grant project together that Shadowcliff was the financial sponsor for, concerning some watershed health in the upper Colorado River. But Ken's resume is quite varied. He is an all-star researcher, consultant, citizen. You were actually named Citizen of the Year, I think, at least once. And of course, he bore witness to the East Troublesome fire, which we all know greatly impacted not just the Grand Lake community, but a huge area of northern Colorado in an unprecedented way. And we live in times where unprecedented fires are becoming more common, but I think a lot of us know and love Shadowcliff and the Grand Lake community. And so we're all interested to hear kind of the backstory of how this happened and what's been going on since then, since last year. So Ken, thank you so much for joining us. I will turn it over to you. I will just briefly mention to everyone that I might have to leave before we're over today. I want to give time for Q&A and conversation at the end. So if I have to bow out at the end, Calvin Gibson will take over for me and close us out. But Ken, thanks for being here. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kelly, and thanks to all of you for being here. And I'm really pleased to be able to give this presentation, to a little bit of background, how it really kind of started out, where, as Kelly referred to, this project we worked on years ago, ended up leading to formation of the Upper Colorado River Watershed Group. And so what we've been over the last few years trying to work here in the Upper Colorado River watershed and looking at issues related to water. And I'll go through some of those as we go along here. And 2 years ago, the year before last, we ended up, the watershed group ended up buying a drone. And since I live overlooking Shadow Mountain, and my interest in all things technological, I had the opportunity to fly that drone very frequently, monitoring the water conditions and looking at what happens here. And so our first summer before last, we took our first look, started looking at the watershed. And after the fire happened, we approached Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment and got a small grant that allowed us this year to start looking at comparing the effects of the fire to previous years. How did the fire affect water quality out here? And so that's what I'm going to be going through here as we go along. Let me bring this up here, and we'll start going through the slides. Sorry here. It's taking its time coming up.
It only does that when you want it to work.
And when I want it to. So the title of this is What Happens When Humans, Fire, Water, and Climate Change Create the Perfect Storm. And basically that was October 21st, 2020. Come on here. And so what I'm going to be showing you here are pictures both from the drone as well as satellite imagery. And in these two pictures, they're being compared. We used we're using some spectral bands that allow us to detect the impacts and compare scenes from year to year. And so if you look on the left, there is September last year before the fire. On the right, the region in the red, you can see the burn area, how it compared, and especially the size of the fire. What you're looking at there is Grand Lake, Shadow Mountain Reservoir, and Granby Reservoir. And as you move over to the right, you can kind of follow that along. And that's where the fire actually jumped over the divide and started tracking down into Estes Park. Thankfully, we had the snows around the 21st, 22nd of October that kind of probably would have done much worse damage if we hadn't had those snows. But again, you see the extent there in that red area there. This is actually looking up the North Inlet, the Tonahutu River, and you're actually looking up where it went over the divide. That's in the park. And the river below you see is the Tonahutu there, North Inlet. And so what we're really looking at as we start looking at these impacts, we're looking at different levels. I'm not showing you any pictures today of where people's properties were impacted, the houses there. That continues to be sensitive here, and so I just want to respect their issues. So we're going to be looking at this from a watershed and a greater perspective, but understanding that individuals were very heavily impacted as well. So this is looking at it from the watershed perspective. Again, this is from my house where I launched from, and across you're looking towards the park and where it went over. This is Shadow Mountain Reservoir. So again, we're taking it from that individual watershed now to the greater watershed that we're looking at. So again, we look at these impacts in various levels of geography. And so when we look at the fire, it left behind two kinds of impacts. One was the immediate and the residual. And we'll go through those. And then it was the individual and the community, okay? And so I kind of want, as we go through here, how you see this in the perspective. Back in May, I had Mark Salinger from Channel 9 came up, and he was doing a video, doing a piece on what we were doing and how we were monitoring. And he actually pointed this out to me. I had taken him over to Shadow Mountain, and we were looking out across the lake, and you got this really beautiful view of the lake. And then I took the drone up, and when we were looking down from the drone, you got a very different perspective. And all of a sudden, what really you saw on the ground was really pretty. When we started looking down at the ground, it became much more impactful. And you'll see this as we go along. So this is a property that we've been working with the people on. And this is a satellite image from September 2020 before the fire. And what looks like, that's a driveway going to their house. But it actually looks like an arrow there. So it kind of points out the area we're going to be looking at. But this was before the fire. And this is what it looked like after the fire. And one of the things I want you to look at on the left, this was an area of willow. It's willow habitat. And we found that to be very interesting as the fire went through. And I'll show you this in the next picture, that what happened. Here it is. So this is what we saw in June when we came back to that property in June. And that dark area you see on the left-hand side, those are the willows. And so what happened when that fire came through, it burned grasslands. In the horizon there, you can see the mountains. That was National Forest. And that's pretty well impacted up there. The grasslands have been coming back pretty well. The fire didn't burn too hot through there. But you can see these willows, they're not yet coming back. And what was happening, they told us before the fire, was that these willow areas are drying out. And I'll talk a little bit more about that because that's fairly significant in terms of what we're talking about in impacts as we go along here. And again, you look at the picture on the right, that's along the river. You can see where the fire went through in forest, where it burned heavily. You're seeing some trees that were singed. The fire wasn't so hot there. You see the grassy areas, which were fairly cooler area, burns are recovering. And then the areas along the river are still showing impact. So again, when I start talking about this now, I want to talk about that watershed, the entire watershed we're talking about here. And that's that you see Grand Lake there, you see Shadow Mountain, and then Granby Reservoir. And what's important here to understand these impacts and these residual impacts is what actually is happening with these water bodies, which have helped lead to the conditions we saw before the fire and which are contributing to the impacts as we continue to go along. So what happens up here with water? On the left, you see June of 2020 before the fire, and on the right, you see in the fall before the fire as well. But what happens up here in the spring, water drains down from the mountains. It comes down through East Inlet and North Inlet out of the park, and then out of the North Fork of the Colorado, coming out of the Never Summer Wilderness area. And those waters go into Grand Lake and Shadow Mountain, and then down through the dam, Shadow Mountain Dam, and into Granby Reservoir. So what's happening in the spring and during runoff is you're getting very clean water that goes down through the system and down into Granby Reservoir, and which would typically go down into the Colorado. But come about July, they start pumping back from Granby Reservoir, okay? And what's happened during this period between runoff and July, when they start coming back, you're collecting water from throughout the watershed, the upper Colorado River watershed. So it's coming down the Fraser River, it comes down Willow Creek. And those waters tend to be have more nutrients in them. And so what happens when they start pumping those waters back from Granby up into Shadow Mountain, they're pumping nutrient laden waters. Shadow Mountain tends to be a shallow reservoir. It gets warm in the summertime, and when those nutrients, we start seeing algal blooms and weeds growing, okay? And so that's what you're looking at there in that right-hand picture, is what happens as you exchange clean waters for dirty waters. And this is then after the fire. Now, what's interesting here about the fire, we see a lot more activity in June, in that spring and segment over here on the left. We can see that Granby Reservoir has some different characteristics already from the fire. And I think what happened here, they were pumping all last winter out of Granby. And part of that was to fill up the reservoirs on the Front Range. But I think another part of it was to take the clean waters that were there before the fire and get those to the Front Range before they started getting runoff with the soot-laden waters that they were expecting in this year. And so you can see in August, when last picture we had, the last satellite picture we've got, again, that water is really active. We're seeing a lot of different characteristics of that water and that are affecting the quality of that water. So what's happening, if you look at the left, this is a discharge of the North Fork. This is coming out of the burn area. And you see along the river there that white stream. Well, it turns out those are, as best we can discern, unfortunately, we don't have any chemical data to look at, but what that tends to be, what we think it is organic matter. So that plants, when they die in these rivers, they release, as they're decaying, they release organic matter. And what happens, you get this organic film out there. And when it goes through turbulence, so when we get some rapids, just up the river are rapids, and that churns the water and creates bubbles. And these bubbles get coated with this organic material, and that organic acts like a surfactant. And if you see to the right there, you can start seeing where films are forming. Okay, and that's been kind of a good indicator for us this year in terms of us watching what's happening and where things are coming from, and how much is actually coming out from these burn areas. On that right hand picture, what you see is the formation of weeds. Last year we were monitoring weed growth in Shadow Mountain, and it was getting fairly common. What we have seen this year, especially after the burn, is a real rapid growth and excessive growth of weeds. This is what's really concerning us now, is one of the effects of the fire. It's sort of a consequence of the fire that's helping to feed it. You can also see in that right picture that water is starting to get cloudy. Typically that would be fairly clear, but we're starting to see a lot of turbidity. And this is as early as June we're seeing it. And again, you see that film up there starting to coagulate and creating these greater areas. This is coming out of the Tanahutu. So this is what's actually coming out of the park. And you can see this film. Again, you're getting quite a bit of film coming through there in early June. And actually even as early as May, we were getting a lot of this material coming down from the fire areas up there. Again, we don't know what the overall impact of these films, if these films are able to sort of attract things and sediments, what they do, and then what their long-term fate. I have seen these films that I collected some in this earlier this year, and they stayed in the water for hours. They did not, the bubbles did not break. So they tend to persist quite a bit. One of the things I would like to do, would have liked to have done, is collected some of these films and analyze them to see if sediments, which could potentially, contain heavy metals or something else, were attracted to these films and concentrating in these films. But that's just speculation, and we don't know at this point. This is what happened. This is again the North Fork. And it was when we had the monsoon rains in July, we had a very heavy release of sediments coming down. You see that on the left-hand picture. Typically, that would be fairly clear water. And then on the right, you see that concentration of the sediments, and then the weeds. All those dark spots in there are the weeds. They're getting coated by these sediments. They're breaking loose. They're floating out into the lake. We're seeing across the lake, and they're carrying these sediments with them. And what's happening is we're starting to see the delta, which we've been worried about for several years, is this year. I think I've seen some much extended growth of that delta coming in there. Again, this is the Tanahutu. In August, we had some heavy rains, and you can see there the soot, which is coming down out of the park up there. It got really pretty heavy in the lake itself. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get pictures during that time. One of the things I found, the limits on my drone imagery as well as satellite, is clouds or overcast. I can't get good pictures. But you can see in the river there, that dark, that is all the soot on the bottom that's collected there. So this is what we're starting to see. Those are weeds. If any of you have been up here on Shadow Mountain and done any kayaking, we have the islands on the south end of the reservoir. And we've seen these weeds were there last year, but you can see how much they've grown this year. I mean, compared to last year, you didn't see them this extensive. And they're really starting to clog. We're getting to a situation where we're starting to get eutrophication. I think what one of the things that happened last year, which has really helped precipitate much of this weed growth, was when they were pumping all summer or all winter. Normally they're not pumping. They usually pump from about July to August, September. But last year, they were, as I said, during the winter, they were pumping to take all the clean water we had and get it over to the Front Range. So we had these nutrient-laden waters going through under the ice all winter long. We actually saw when the ice broke up that the weeds, and this was in April, about middle of April, the weeds were already there in the areas that were open. And so whatever they did during the winter just sort of helped promote this. Again, I attribute that as potentially as one of the fire effects. They were trying to get the clean water, and so it led to additional pumping, much heavier pumping, and this is what's starting to happen. Again, you see here, the lake is a popular kayaking area. That's the plume of the water coming out, the turbidity that's extending that. And so people now who are going out there to kayak, where they used to be able to go out in fairly clean waters, they're kayaking and boating through fairly turbid waters. So again, we've got a loss of recreation value as one of those impacts of the fire. Again, what you see here, you're looking back towards the North Fork. You can see how that delta has come out. And if you look to the left of there, in the middle left of that picture, that's where that delta has extended and is starting to fill in. And in the foreground, that sort of green and those dark patches, those are the weeds extending out there. We did not see that last year. It's getting much greener, and we're seeing those weeds coming out there. And so what we're starting to see is the lake shallowing up, and then weeds starting to grow in those waters. This is, again, last year we had weeds around these boat docks. This year, I don't know how the people can get their boats out of those docks with those kinds of weeds. And that's gotten worse over the summer as I've watched that grow. And we're starting to see that in other areas around the lake. Around the shoreline, we've got another marina, and the weeds have grown quite extensively out there. And again, it creates a hazard to boating for people who suck these weeds up and cause them to burn up their engines. And I've seen people skiing out there that go through weed patches like this, and that's always a concern. Somebody hits those weeds and they'll come to a sudden stop, throw them out of their skis, and hopefully they're flexible and know how to hit the water on something like that. But it's getting quite concerning as to how extensive this weed growth is getting. So this kind of leaves us with two questions. Why did it happen, and will it get better? So let me talk about this, because the fire did not start October 21st. It started way before then. It started getting set up way before then. And let me sort of start talking about it. It actually started in the 1800s, okay? That's when the first trans-mountain diversion was begun. That was the Grand Ditch, and that was built. Water was in the Never Summer Wilderness, now the Never Summer Wilderness, and they built the Grand Ditch and to collect water and take it over, and it dumps into the Poudre River. That diversion takes about 30 to 40% of the water out of the Kawanichi Valley. It runs through the park and then comes down through the North Fork into Shadow Mountain. In the 1990s, mid-1990s, CSU did some studies on the effects of that diversion. And they found that taking that water out of the park has led to depletion of the water table, lowering of the water table, the lost riparian habitat, invasive species coming in, and having an overall effect on the park itself. Right now, the park, we understand, is starting to look at possibly trying to get some beaver introduction back into the Kawanichi Valley, which hopefully would help alleviate some of that. But Then in the 30s and 40s is when we started looking at the Colorado Big Thompson project, Moffett Tunnel project, and the projects further down in the Colorado, as we all know. So these diversions are now taking about 70 to 80% of the water out of the upper Colorado River here. Here in Grand County, that's taken 80% of the water out of this watershed. And it has led to about 300 miles of impaired streams. And by impaired, I mean under the state of Colorado guidelines, their 303D listing of what constitutes an impaired water. The next thing that started happening, which has influenced this, is boomers. We all came along. We're all children of the boomers. And so our population started growing. All right. In the 70s, and I'm kind of giving a date of the 70s, that's most recent I've heard of people starting to talk about when climate change started happening. This is when we started seeing temperatures starting to warm up, as we know now, starting to get into droughts and so on. And that's Mother Nature doing her thing. And then in the 90s here in Colorado, we really started seeing an increase of population here that led to habitat loss and urbanization that's helped feed all of this sort of thing. So what the landowners were telling us last summer, like I said, before the fire, was they were seeing their willow habitats were drying up. The fish in the North Fork were getting fungal infections because water flows were low and temperatures were high in the river. So we had this stress. And all of a sudden, then somebody lit a match that started a fire. And so with drought conditions, it came through with a vengeance. But it was all of these things which really set those conditions up for us. And that's the concerning part, because this is where we're facing right now. What's going to happen as we move forward? And the question is, will it get better? And here's where I really have my concerns. And I just want to give you some statements that the people who really control this have the ability to help fix these things, what they have told us over the years. And in 2 environmental impact statements and a water provider representative has said, TMDs produce no significant environmental impacts. Okay, that's in spite of the fact that we have got 300 miles of impaired streams in Grand County, most of that as a result of Trans Mountain diversions. Okay, I look at that fire that it came through, and what we had lost were riparian areas which could possibly have mitigated the progression of that fire. When it went through some of those areas, it just went right through riparian areas like they didn't exist. The Colorado State water official said, and this was a meeting I had with them in Denver, so I can attest to this one, it's straight from the horse's mouth. When push comes to shove, there are 3 million of us on the Front Range and 15,000 in Grand County. And my question I asked him was, is Grand County being made the sacrificial lamb to the Front Range about water issues? You know, we were talking to them that, hey, we're having these problems. We've got to look at this. We've got to address, we've got to address these problems. But that was his answer to me. A federal official and a water provider representative, we will not spend large funds in Grand County because it will set a precedent that will force us to spend $3.5 billion on other projects. Okay. Unfortunately, right now, the funds that are coming from the government, there are some EWP funds. These are emergency funds that are there to help fix some of the problems. Those funds are directed towards private lands. It's a good thing, you know, for the people who impacted their lands. It does not fix right now the public lands. So it's not money for the Forest Service. It's not money for things like the National Recreation Area here. We're trying to see if we can't get some funds that will help. We can direct towards these areas that are impacted and so many of us use for recreation. A county official said to us, actually said this in a Board of County Commissioners meeting. The North Fork is a red herring, and we know reservoirs silt up, so the county's position is to do nothing. So far, even though these problems have existed since 1953, there's been nothing done to mitigate these impacts. Same Grand County official, you have a choice of having algae or weeds. These lakes are heavily used for recreation. Any of you have been up here, you know how pretty they are. And yet I look at the weeds now coming in, and it's really concerning because it's a loss of an area next to a national park. These are of national significance. Colorado continues to place water storage projects as a top priority in the state water plan. I was having a conversation today, and we are seeing 4 new reservoirs in the works right now to take more water. I don't know where that water is going to come from. Three of those projects, 2 are on the Front Range, down around, those of you who live in Fort Collins, 2 of those are there. 1 is up here just above the fire burn in the East Troublesome area. And the other one is in the Homestake area, the Homestake in the Holy Cross Wilderness area. This was a project that was killed about 15, 20 years ago, right after the Two Forks project. Unfortunately, it's raising its head again. So this is again one that's got to be a concern to all of us. And as I said, no money is yet to be allocated to restore aquatic resources and habitats. So we continue, we haven't fixed the problems we've got, and we're looking at more projects coming along, which I fear are just going to exacerbate, make it even worse. As I showed you in that earlier picture there, Mother Nature is going to do her thing. We can't change Mother Nature. The only thing we can change is our behavior to help try and mitigate some of this stuff going forward. We'll see if that happens. So again, this is one of those pictures I wanted to show you. It's all in one's perspective. This picture was taken early one morning, and the next picture I took of this, I turned the camera down, facing down, and it took a picture of weeds. If you look at it from this direction, you don't see a problem. It's like I said, it's when I took the drone out and put the drone and gave the picture straight down, then you see the problems that exist. And so again, it's where that perspective comes in as to what we see and how we see it and how we perceive it and how we want to address it. If we're going to continue to look at it as a beautiful place, it's not there. I mean, when I look at it and I look down into those weeds, it is not a pretty place anymore. I refuse to put a boat on the lake anymore because I'm afraid of what it'll do to the boat. I won't go kayaking out there because if I kayak in between those islands and I tip over in those islands in those weeds, it becomes a danger of trying to get out without drowning. So this is where we've come to. It's you know, I'm giving you a horrible picture of it, a very pessimistic picture, but it's one that is very concerning. And we're trying to get that message out to people that we have to start looking at this and dealing with these problems in a whole different paradigm than we have before. So with that, I'll kind of throw it open if there's any questions or comments or.
Well, thank you so much, Ken. Thank you for that presentation. I know it's not a rosy picture maybe, but you're doing important work here. And I think this is all information that we need to know. So anyone is welcome to unmute themselves and ask questions, or you could use the chat box if you'd rather. I might kick us off here and ask you just, is the Upper Colorado River Watershed Group addressing any of these specific concerns that you've raised today? And is there any progress sort of being made there with that group?
The good news we've got, yes, to answer your question in short, yes, but several years ago, there was a lawsuit against the Windy Gap firming project that was filed against the environmental impact statement and the record of decision on the Windy Gap firming project. That project is proposed to take an additional 30,000 acre feet of water out of Grand County through Shadow Mountain and Grand Lake when it's completed. We actually lost the lawsuit, but we were moving along to appeal the lawsuit when they decided to go to arbitration or go to some negotiations. And out of it came there's a group now that is receiving $15 million. The $15 million will be going into the Grand Foundation. It will be controlled by 3 people from the Upper Colorado Rivershed group and 3 people from the other side. So that $15 million is basically to be spent for helping to restore some of these areas that have been impacted. Unfortunately, $15 million, while it's a nice sum, we've estimated that before the fire, we were looking at $100 million to fix the problems that needed to be fixed in the watershed. With the fire, it's, it may have doubled. The funds I think they're getting from the EWP is around $35 million, but again, that only addresses the private lands. It doesn't address all the other public lands that were impacted. And 90% of the fire impacted area were public lands. So that'll give you some sense of still the needs that exist out there.
Thank you. Is this a good time to unshare your screen?
Sure.
Or you don't, okay. That way we can see each other. There we all are. Let's open it up for questions. Does anyone have questions or comments for Ken?
Ken Stafford. I now live in Kansas, but I used to live out your way, and I spent awful lot of time up in Grand Lake and around that area. What's the concern now about the burning on the east side of the lake? Because that's fairly susceptible to a lot of burn. And then also with all of the killing of all the trees through the pine bark beetle over the last 20 years, did that make the fire worse, or did it help on the mitigation where there wasn't any, where it had been cleared after all of the death of those trees?
Yeah, and maybe start with your second part, and I'll come back to the east, because that is a very large concern. The pine beetle did fuel the fire. Actually, the day before we were all evacuated, when the federal officials got to the fire and was listening to a debriefing, and the official had said, when it was still contained just to the area just north of Parshall, the small area, and they were saying that if that fire started moving and reached some of those areas outside that present zone, and it was where it was a lot of pine beetle down, they said then they expected the inferno to really begin. And that's actually what happened when it reached those areas. And then we had the winds that kicked up that afternoon. It started creating its own winds. And some of you may have heard it jumped 125. And when it jumped 125, that fire had really started going. And when it jumped 125, it went about 20 miles in 3 hours. That's what caught most of us by surprise, because all of us were looking there and we had pre-evacuation orders. But everybody kept saying, well, it's 20 miles away. When it gets closer, we'll all evacuate. Well, the thing was, we all had 15 minutes to evacuate because it went so fast due to that fuel that was down in the forest. And so when we look at the east side of the lake, yes, that is a concern, because if you look at Shadow Mountain, which is part of the park, there's a lot of dead stuff down there. I was yesterday in town talking to a person, and there was lightning strikes, and he was saying, yeah, I was looking over yesterday at the lightning strikes over on that mountain. And so we're really concerned it's going to take one lightning strike, and that's a real tinderbox over there. So.
Thank you.
One thing I would comment on, if any of you get a chance to come up to Grand Lake, there's an exhibit that they've put together, the chamber put together, and it just tells the story of the fire from people's perspective and their stories of what they experienced during the fire, and some of the things that if they were able to recover, that on exhibit in the kind of a museum exhibit. It's very powerful. Lots of people have gone through, but it's quite impactful as to what people went through and how they experienced it. And
Ken, this is Doug. Shadow Mountain didn't receive any fire damage, did it?
you were very close. Kelly can probably tell you more, but I think you had some pretty substantial smoke damage. Actually,
Well, no, I meant Shadow Mountain.
Oh, no, Shadow Mountain. No, I'm sorry. I was thinking Shadow Cliff. No, Shadow Mountain did not. It did not get to there. It stayed to the north of 34. Well, to the north of 34 till it got to the park. And then it started coming across the mountains, and it got up to about the East Inlet. It didn't come across over to Shadow Mountain at that point.
Right. So we don't want to go remove all the trees in Shadow Mountain to prevent lightning from starting them on fire, do we?
Well, that's a park. That's part of the park. And the park's policy is they don't do any mitigation. And so I think right now, as far as I understand, if a fire does start up there, they will basically be trying to save the homes along Jericho Road. But whether they would do anything, well, you'd probably get some retardant supplied and so on. But I don't think that the park has any plans to do any mitigation up there.
Right. And I think that was a reaction from the pine beetle.
Right.
When
That's
the park
correct.
decided to do that?
That's correct. Yeah.
Anne, I think you had a question next.
I have two friends who lost family cabins going down the road from Winding River Ranch. And at the end of that road, when we drove through it about a month ago or so, it looked like from a distance that cabin that was built in recent history, that did fire resistant materials, that put rocks around, that didn't have trees nearby, it survived, from where I could see. And I was wondering if Grand County in the future is going to put on, building restrictions of what can be built. One friend especially, she backed up to the golf course. She had trees all over the place. She had a huge wood pile really close. It was, the place is made completely out of wood except for the roof. And it completely burned, and I'm wondering with the rebuilding, if they're going to put on more restrictions of how you build in Grand County.
It's interesting you asked that question. Couple comments there where you were at Winding River Ranch. It was interesting where parts of that fire came through, and especially there with the park, you do see burned areas and heavily burned, and then next to it you may see not so heavily burned. Sun Valley, if you got a chance to get up to Sun Valley, that area was probably, from my perspective, what I saw, the hottest part of the fire, and was really devastated through there. And I chose not to show pictures from over there, but basically all you saw were ashes were left in those parts. I took a tour up 125 2 weeks ago with one of the fire people who was actually leading the response at the time. And we got into quite a discussion about building codes and so on. And I think, if the fire department has anything to do, they're going to be trying to get some fire codes up here, building codes up here, more strict. Whether that happens or not, we'll see. But I think, and watching the behavior of that fire, one of the stories I think at Winding River Ranch, I don't know if you heard this one, but they had 3 little buildings there that were kind of a sort of a ghost town exhibit. And there were 3 little buildings in a row. And the middle building was a church, shaped, as it was a representation of a church. And the 2 buildings on the outside burned, but the one in the middle, the church didn't burn. So it, whether it was divine intervention or not, I don't know, but it was the sort of strange things you saw in that fire and how it went. I think some of the most interesting things I heard was that within the smoke before that the day we evacuated and there was tremendous smoke all around, the fire people told me that within that fire, that smoke, temperatures were about 2,000 degrees. And what happened was a lot of the fires were started by embers coming out of those smoke plumes and landing on buildings. And that's why you would see a building burned and the one next to it not, because of embers landing on a building. And that's what they said why it jumped the divide, was that there were embers because of the winds that were carried over the divide. As you know, up there along Trail Ridge, it's pretty much, tundra and rocks. And it was embers that were carried over the divide and landed on the other side that started the fires over there.
Well, just an example of how hot it got. My friend that backs up to the golf course with all the trees around, on the 2nd floor, the bathtub didn't fall through the floor like you would think. It was so hot, it exploded. And there were chunks of it all over the property. But, if they don't put in restrictions very soon, they're already rebuilding at Winding River. They're already building down that road. There's like 3 or 4 places that are already building. My friend's family is planning on rebuilding next spring. They'll probably continue to do what they've done in the past until restrictions are put in place.
There's a lot of mitigation going on in terms of neighborhoods now, several programs. Here in our area, we've got about 9 acres of open space that we're having that cleared, thinned and trimmed up. The fire department has come through and they're working with homeowners to fire safe their properties. But again, those are existing homes, and I agree with you. The new buildings that go up, hopefully they will come in with different kinds of building materials that can help mitigate all of this.
Thank you.
So Ken, thanks for sharing with us. I'm thinking back to the Big Thompson Compact set some specifications for the water table, or the level for Grand Lake. And I'm wondering, has the actual water level been affected as a result of the fire? And then secondly, were there any water clarity standards set in that early Big Thompson Compact?
Good questions. Under the Senate Document 80, which was the authorizing paper for the Colorado Big Thompson, it did establish that the water level in Grand Lake would not change. And actually, I don't think it can ever change, because the problem is the way the hydraulics run. What Shadow Mountain does is actually a pump, so that when they start pumping, they pump water into Shadow Mountain to kind of raise the level in Shadow Mountain to make the water flow into Grand Lake. So that's really why that Grand Lake has to pretty much stay stable at its level. Now, having said that, Granby this year, we're seeing they're really pumping it down. What I've been told, I don't know whether it's true, I haven't been able to confirm it, that they're pumping it down about 50% of its capacity this year. So where the water level really changes is in Granby Reservoir. They did not fill Granby this year. We did not have enough water to fill it. As I said, we're going down, if we go down to 50% this next year, that sort of leads me to believe we may be heading into a Lake Mead, Lake Powell situation where we're going into a declining spiral if we continue with these with the drought conditions that we've been going through. So we're going to be watching that one very closely. What's interesting, I have to throw this one out in terms of the clarity. Last year, because of the weeds and algal growth in Grand Lake that again are contributed to by this pumping, they almost lost the tunnel. I was told by an official here in the town that they had to get out there about 2 o'clock in the morning and put aerators down in front of the Adams Tunnel because the algae and weeds had grown up on their screens and was blocking the flow through the tunnel. And so those aerators, they needed those to clear the screen so they could keep that tunnel going. That's there. Now, again, with regards to that clarity standard, in 2016, they were supposed to set a clarity standard for Grand Lake. It did not get set because they could still not figure out how to meet the standards for clarity. So at the time, the Water Quality Control Commission and CDPHE came in and said, okay, for 5 years, go through this for the next 5 years and see what you can do to fix the problem. Well, this is the end of the 5 years. And again, this is my opinion, so it's worth what I'm telling you. But what I'm reading is when I was told that you can have either the weeds or the algae, what they were telling me is they're trying to control the pumping this year to limit the algal growth. As I interpret it, when you limit the algae growing, those nutrients still have to go somewhere. And those nutrients are going to the weeds. So the weeds are taking most of the nutrients, which before were split between weeds and algae. And that's why you're getting the proliferation of the weeds this year, because there's so much more to feed them. And so we'll see what happens when they come. They're supposed to set that clarity standard this year. I think that's really going to have to be looked at and discussed, from what's happening up here.
Have you seen an increase in the temperature of the water?
Oh yeah,
because that will certainly affect the algae blooms.
Yeah, that has been a problem for the last several years. And we were watching last year in the rivers, monitoring the rivers. They've got gauges. USGS has got gauges in most of the streams and so on. And we saw many of the streams getting up to 20 degrees C and higher. That really exceeds the state standard for water temperatures in these streams. And so it's getting to be a problem through the lakes and on all the streams up here. And actually, again, this year, earlier this year, they were advising, asking people not to fish after about noon because of temperatures and low water flows. So, recreational fishing is being impacted.
Ken, this is Tally. I don't know if can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. We drove. My mom and I drove over. Anyway, I missed. You broke up quite a bit. But my question to you, Ken, and maybe you've already said this, but what would be your dream solution to all these issues?
My dream what?
Solution for.
Well, I've got a list of about 7 things that I've put together that I've handed some people. One of them is we need to change state water laws. The Colorado water laws were put together in the 1800s. They were set up for a completely different environment and population and demographics and everything else. And right now, I think they're a hindrance to us moving forward on doing things. I'll tell you some of the things I talked about. One is that we've never really talked about the true cost of water. Okay, when we ask people from the Front Range where does their water come from, and they tell us from our tap, and we say no, it doesn't. It comes up from the mountains. And the problem is, when you're paying your $28 a month, that doesn't cover the cost of what it is costing us in the mountains as not just as us in Grand County, but all of us as citizens, in terms of the environmental damage that is occurring. Like I said, in 1953 was when the people in Grand County started saying, or in Grand Lake, started asking the Bureau of Reclamation to fix the problems. The problems have never been fixed. And so we've continued to create these problems over the last 70 years. And now we've got these tremendous costs facing us to fix these problems. And where's this money going to come from? The state water plan, which is, it's great we have a state water plan, but the state water plan, there are two major components: is water storage, more water storage, okay? And the second one is conservation. Well, in 2000, well, let's take this year. We're pumping down the water here in Granby, okay? And it's going to the Front Range, and people on the Front Range are watering lawns, right? That water, we're damaging our resources up here to water lawns on the Front Range. Is that what we want to do? So, I mean, I live up here, I say no. People live on the Front Range probably say yes, but you can't have both. You can't have an environment up here where you can go fishing and boating and kayaking and whatever, and then expect it to be clean water. So that's another one I think we need to look at.
Well, so I know those issues, and I just tried to do my best educating my friends when we went camping from the Front Range. So education would be one solution. Getting the laws changed from the 1800s is another dream solution, right?
Right.
And just more public knowledge statewide, I would say, is what I'm hearing you say, so that they have a better understanding.
Well, I've been sort of negative and pessimistic in this whole talk, so I'll tell you the one I think is even worse. It's going, our officials, okay? Let me give you the other example, one that really frustrates me. When I mentioned to you about the lawsuit that was there. Well, when they were going through the negotiations, I wasn't involved in the negotiations, but the people who were involved in the negotiations, they told me, they said, well, sitting at the table when we were doing this negotiations, we're Northern Water and the Department of Natural Resources. And I said, wait a minute, what is Department of Natural Resources doing in these negotiations where they're an intervener on the side of Northern? I said, if you go to the Department of Natural Resources, their mission is to provide a balanced view or balanced management of water between ag, domestic, and recreation. And I'm saying, so why are they in a intervening on the part of Northern, when we're, the basic opposition is the fact that it's damaging our water resources up here? Well, it turns out that the state had invested $90 million into Chimney Hollow, the reservoir that this is all around. And I said, wait a minute, they're a state agency, they've invested $90 million and they've got a conflict of interest. How can they issue permits for a project when they're invested $90 million into the project? then on top of it, which I've complained to some of our officials, I'm saying, wait a minute, those are my tax dollars. I'm now paying to create a reservoir, which is damaging the place where I live. You know, it's sort of a double whammy on me. How do we get by with this? Those are the things I think we need to start looking at. If we're going to have these water projects, who's going to pay for them? And it goes back to my initial conversation with the state water policy official. He said there's 3 million of us and 15,000 of you. So you guys are basically out in the cold.
So do we have any officials who should be there? I mean, obviously somebody should be there to protect us in our water rights. Who is that?
Well,
is it commissioners? Is it our state representatives? Is it our, who?
It's all of the above, Tally. I mean, these are federal waters, they're federal projects, they're administered by state agencies, and permits are driven by county officials. And so they're made at the local, state, and federal level. And they all have to be brought, into the fold, so to speak.
So why isn't the county charging more for the water that we're giving away?
We don't. You hit upon one of my favorite topics now. What we have been
I didn't mean to interrupt, but I couldn't resist asking the question.
You asked my favorite question here. I'm glad you asked it. What we have been advocating up here is that there needs to be an impact fee on every gallon of water that goes over through the divide. We've advocated, I think it's about 0.001 cent per gallon. And that would generate for us about $12 to $15 million a year up here, which we would use to fix these problems that exist up here. It's a water impact fee. We get a lot of pushback on that, but we're working to try and see at some point if we can get an impact fee. And we've estimated the cost. We've done studies on it to look at the cost. We looked at in Denver on just the water Denver Water was pumping, that it would add about $4 a month to a household in Denver's distribution network.
Well, and let me just say though, that's pretty big. $4 a month is
$48 a year. That's not much.
We're all on the same page here. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
I mean, that's $4 a month is going to be tough.
Well, let me put it another way. My water bill here is $75 a month. That's low for here. Many of the people here are paying over $100 a month for water. The basic water bill in Denver is $28 a month.
That's a great argument, Ken. I will concede to that. I'm
Let
just
me
saying,
throw out
trying to
another
convince
one
somebody in
here.
Denver to pay $4 extra a month.
Yeah, our water rights for our HOA basically state we're on a well. They basically state that each household is allowed to irrigate 200 square feet of grass. Okay. Does anybody on the Front Range have a water restriction that says you can only water 200 square feet of your grass? I live on Shadow Mountain Lake, and I can only water 200 square feet. These are the things that are out there, and they seem like small items, but they add up to us anyway, when we start looking at it, is how do we get this message across that the true cost of water, we are paying the true cost of water up here. I pay 3 taxes to fix things that have been broken by the Trans Mountain Diversion. I pay a county tax. It's called the 1A tax. I pay a Colorado River District tax now, which we've been a mill levy to fix what's been busted. And then now I'm going to be paying for Chimney Hollow Reservoir, which I fought against.
So Ken, who are the people that we should be voting for, or when you keep talking about we want to pass this, who who are you working with exactly? Are we talking Joe Negussi? Are we talking Carol Morgan? I mean, who are we talking?
Like I said, Tally, I had some people up here the other day from the state, and some people were trying to talk to get them to help us with it. Changes have to be made at the state level. I think that's where the key problems exist. It's like I said, the state is investing into these water projects. Their state water plan says we're going to build more reservoirs. And as long as the state is on that tact, we're going to continue to lose this water from the western slope. It's not just Grand County. The Rio Grande watershed is in worse shape than Grand County, than the Colorado River watershed, if you can believe it. There's more water being drained out of there. They were figuring they were going to go dry in about 150-mile stretch of the Rio Grande this summer. So it's all of the basins up here that are being impacted by this water being taken from the western slope. And again, that basically is done at the state level. That's where we have to be talking.
So how can anybody think that they can build more reservoirs when the water's the same as it is now, or going to go less? And where in the water rights of the Colorado do you exist? I mean, with 100 million people south and west of you that are using that water, what are your rights that are left?
Well, Colorado has their water rights under the Colorado River Compact. So that's where the Colorado River gets theirs, and where the Colorado River District deals with those issues. I want to go back to the first part of your question, though. If I can remember what it was, I apologize. Could you?
Well, the first part was, how can we build more reservoirs to save more water when there's no more water? And let me.
That's another good question. And I mentioned the two people I had up here last week, and one of them was a state representative. Okay. And he lives over in a suburb of Denver, and he was talking to their officials over there and about water. And the guy was telling him that they had 11 years worth of water before they ran out of water. And now they're down to 9. And he asked him, and he said, well, when you run out of water, what are you going to do? And he said, the guy looked at him, he says, well, what do you mean? What am I going to do? He said, I'm just going to go buy more water. We don't create water where you can, that you can go buy it. It's allocated. We're over allocated. The state is very over allocated for water. And this is one of the interesting things up here as well. My HOA ours are not senior water rights. Ours are junior water rights. And so when I was asking the state water official, and I told him that, I said, I've got junior water rights. If the majority of them are owned by Northern and Denver Water. And if we really get into a drought situation where they start pulling their water rights, mine go into a lower tier where I can run out of water in my subdivision. I will not be able to draw water. And that's the problem we face, that all of us face here, is that because of the way it's structured, the whole western slope, most people have very junior water rights over here. And so my wife keeps saying we're going to end up like Mad Max, where we're going to be in water wars, And it's
you have the Martian to look at.
What was that, Tally?
Did you see the movie The Martian, or
Right.
read the book?
Correct. Yeah. And I keep saying that. I mean, this is one of the things I keep saying, are we going to come to a situation where we're going to be creating space capsules, and we're going to be living under space capsules so we can have water? Or go to Dune. Look what they did in Dune. They had the suit where you recycled your waste. We're not addressing, this is the problem. We're still looking at the simple solution of we can still go get water. We can still go get water. Look what's happening in California, right? California is not going to have enough water to feed LA. They're going to make a choice. They're going to feed agriculture. Or they're going to give it to LA. What they need to be doing on the west coast of California is putting in desalination plants. The problem is desalination is expensive. It's going to be expensive water for people to pay with. It's going to be a lot more than that $4 a month that I'm asking for. And so, you know, you have the desal to feed the towns, the city, and then the Colorado River to feed the agriculture. But you're not going to be able to feed both. Just this week, they said that will not be releasing water out of Lake Powell anymore. They're not going to release water downstream. So that's going to create a very significant problem down through the lower basin down through there. And like I said, this planning should have been in the works years ago, because now it's upon us and we're still looking at a solution that doesn't exist. We'll just go buy more water.
Okay, we're a little bit more than an hour, so I wanted to check in with everybody and to see if there's any further questions that we have, especially regarding the troublesome fire and how it's affecting us in Grand County. Ken, you've done an excellent job and want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to ask any further questions.
If I might, Calvin, just feel free to contact me if you got any questions, but we're the Upper Colorado River Watershed Group.org. If you get a chance, you can see us there and see what we're doing, and you know, we'd welcome your inputs or participation.
All righty, I'm going to upload something really quick that I would like for you guys to see, because one of our staff members this summer, her name is Julia Del Razio. She created some artwork using the ash from the troublesome fire. And if you look in the chat right now, you can see one of the bears that she created. And it's just an example of something that is really horrible and that has impacted people's lives in such a rough way. And yet she's figured out a way to bring beauty out of that by creating artwork out of the ash of the troublesome fire, which we feel is something really special at Shadow Cliff. So if you have a chance, check her artwork out. She will be doing the next Communiversity. Mark your calendars for September 8th at 4 p.m. She will be walking us through Get Creative with Julia Del Razio. And then on September 23rd, we will have Leadership Wisdom by Ariana. We all know Ariana. She's our past president, and we know that she can definitely lead us through a very quality conversation regarding leadership. I was at Shadow Cliff the last couple of weekends, and I have to take our hats off to the staff and to the volunteers that prepared Shadow Cliff for this season. The place is spotless. It is spanking new. We suffered a lot of smoke damage during this fire, and the people that have gotten together to clean everything, the pillows are very plush. It's very nice. If you have a chance to come up and say hi over the next couple of weeks, that would be wonderful. Does anyone else have anything else they would like to share or say before we close out tonight?
Well, I really thank you. It's
Yes.
really been most interesting.
Pardon, Ken, say that again.
I said, I just want to thank you. It's really been most interesting. I have a great deal of interest in this.
Thank you.
Yes, and
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you to the Shadow Cliff staff last summer too. We were able to come up and rent a cabin for 3 nights and felt very safe the way they handled everything during COVID. And it was so nice to be in the mountains, even, you know, with COVID going on. And they did an excellent job. We love Shadow Cliff. We've been coming off and on since the late 70s.
right on, yes. All righty. Anyone else? Well, thank you so much, Ken. You're absolutely wonderful. A man that's like a walking encyclopedia when it comes to this area of Colorado. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone else for joining us tonight. Thank you so much for your support, and we will see you soon.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Calvin.
Al.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Ken. It was wonderful. Thank you, Calvin, too, for taking over for Kelly.
Yes.
Looking forward to the next one, too. Very.
Yeah, that was really interesting. I had no idea about the water problem, you know, and the algae and the, oh man, it's like a domino effect,
Mhm.
really bad. This needs to make the news, though. The guy that came up from the news station, was anything put on the local news? I'm a pretty big news hound, but I didn't see anything on the local news in Denver.
I'm not sure. I don't know.
Because they really need to be reporting this.
Yeah.
That's for sure. We're in big trouble.